Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
1,000 feet and climbing.
A brand new 737 takes off during an intense storm.
They should be there by now.
And then mysteriously falls from the sky over West Africa.
Those who operate these type of aircraft, they have the same question: what happened? What happened in Cameroon?
Investigators scour the crash site for clues.
The ground over there.
This was the toughest accident scene I've been on in my career.
But look at this.
When the investigators review the flight data,
We're crashing!
they discover there was an inexplicable fight for control in the cockpit.
Left! Left! Left correction!
Who flies like that?
In Douala, Cameroon, Kenya Airways Flight 507 is almost an hour behind schedule.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to wait for the weather conditions to improve before we take off.
A severe storm must pass before the pilots can depart. There are 108 impatient passengers on board. Many need to catch connecting flights. Flight 507 began in Abidjan earlier in the day. It's now bound for Nairobi, Kenya.
507 was a very common flight for Kenya Airways, particularly last decade. The amount of traffic from East Africa to West Africa has really increased, partially because there's much more business going on.
The Boeing 737NG, recently acquired by Kenya Airways, is the newest generation of twin-engine commercial jets.
This was a new era of aviation in Africa, where airlines, and particularly the bigger ones, invest in brand new aircraft.
Captain Francis Wamwea is in command of tonight's flight. He's an experienced pilot with more than 8,000 hours in the cockpit. Andrew Kiuru is his first officer. The young pilot joined Kenya Airways a year ago.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
The pilots use the 737's onboard weather radar to monitor the storm.
Looks like there might be a way around it.
Now that the storm has moved off the end of the runway, Captain Wamwea believes he can fly past it.
It's quite common that the weather may be a factor in delay in Africa because of its severity, so it's not in that respect a surprise for the operator to find this kind of weather at that time of the night.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup.
Okay, 507. Startup approved.
Startup checklist. Quickly, please.
Generators on.
A few minutes before midnight, Flight 507 is finally ready for takeoff.
Okay. Request taxi clearance.
Kenya 507 requesting taxi clearance.
Taxi runway 12, Kenya 507.
Taxi runway 12.
Kenya 507.
Put on the wipers.
Right is clear.
The crew taxis to the runway. There's one flight ahead of them, Royal Air Maroc Flight 287.
Royal Air Maroc 287, in position. Runway 12, latest weather, please. Visibility 800 meters. Wind calm. Rain, moderate thunderstorms.
All right.
287, clear for takeoff.
The Royal Air Maroc flight departs without incident.
Wait till we line up.
Okay. Usually, things happen quickly, though.
Okay. Try to keep up.
Captain Wamwea double-checks the storm's position
Let's have a look.
and confirms the route around the lingering storm cell.
Tower, Kenya 507.
After departure, we would like to maintain a heading.
Slightly left of runway due to weather ahead.
Right?
Sorry, slightly right.
Just after the aircraft took off, the plan was to make a small turn to the right to avoid the most active weather cells that they saw on the weather radar in front of them.
Approved.
Okay. All done.
Ladies and gentlemen, a kind reminder to ensure your seatbelts are well fastened for takeoff. Cabin crew to your seats. Okay. Takeoff thrust is set. Speed building on board.
Check.
80 knots.
Check.
V1. Rotate.
Just after midnight, Kenya Airways Flight 507 finally departs for Nairobi.
Gear up.
Okay. (1,000 feet and climbing).
Heading select.
Selected. Check.
The 737 starts turning right to avoid the storm.
N1.
Okay, command.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yep.
(2,400 feet and climbing).
Now we're getting into it. Allah!
Bank angle. Bank angle.
Suddenly, the 737 rolls dangerously to the right.
Allah!
Bank angle. Bank
The captain fights to level the plane,
Bank angle. Bank angle.
but it continues banking further and further right.
Bank angle. Bank angle.
Despite the pilot's efforts, they keep rolling.
Bank angle. Bank angle.
Yeah, we are crashing. Left.
Bank
Left.
angle. Bank angle.
Left correction.
Bank angle. Bank angle.
Five hours later, the controller in Douala is ending his shift.
Dula Tower. No reason I can think of. They should be there by now.
Kenya Airways Flight 507 should have landed in Nairobi 45 minutes ago, but the plane has still not arrived.
Sure.
And no one even knows where to start looking for it.
This is Romania, where contrasting landscapes embrace old legends. With Gothic castles, winding mountain roads, and Windsory forest railways, and where rural traditions meet modern engineering to help rebuild the past. Europe from Above, the new season, continues with Romania on National Geographic.
Uživaj u Dukat jogurtu od domaćeg mlijeka sa 100% prirodnim sastojcima. Jer Dukat jogurt je prirodan kao i ti.
Neću se vezati, važno je samo dobro se zezati.
Ostaću slobodan, neću se vezati, važno je samo. Pokaži svoju pravu prirodu.
It don't bother me if you're old or young, if you got lots of money or you got next to none. I don't mind. I say each to their own.
Svežinu Tik-Tak ukusa otkrivaš nežno, sloj po sloj. Tik-Tak, osveži svoj dan nežnošću. Na Tik-Tak pakovanjima skeniraj QR kod i uživaj u velikom izboru muzike, igrica i ostalog.
Pravo u srce grada na Gracija Shopping Night.
U Rajićeva shopping centru i Knez Mihajlovoj ulici 28. oktobra ne propustite kupovinu po specijalnim popustima na aktualne kolekcije. Samo za vas.
Budite u centru pažnje.
Budite u centru dešavanja.
Dobrodošli. Najbolji shopping je u srcu grada.
Da li je vaš imunitet ugrožen? Supradin Immunoboost. Zahvaljujući vitaminu C, vitaminu D i cinku, pomaže u zaštiti imuniteta cele porodice. Supradin Immunoboost. Dobitna kombinacija za imunitet.
Za neke se stvari lako zagrejati. Kao za domaći ukus Podravka supe, koji u naše živote uvek donosi osjećaj topline. Baš zato smo zagrejani za supu već 65 godina. Podravka.
It's a necessity to get out and capitalize in this time of year. Alaska has a very short growing season, so it's kind of a one-shot opportunity.
When you have a homestead, there's no such thing as done. I saw the bear opening our door. It's just another weird year in Alaska.
It's out with the cold and in with the new. A brand new season, Alaska, the next generation, on National Geographic.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
Kenya Airways Flight 507 was due in Nairobi at 6:15 a.m. local time. But it never arrived. By morning, news of the missing 737 has spread. Families and friends of the passengers want to know where their loved ones are. Engelbert Zawa Etundi worked for Cameroon's Civil Aviation Authority.
When I first heard that an aircraft was missing, I immediately thought we were going to have a catastrophe on our hands.
2 days later, search teams finally locate the wreckage of Kenya 507. It's 3.5 miles southeast of Douala Airport. The 737 has crashed into a mangrove swamp and is submerged in mud and water. There are no survivors.
As a nation, we are united in grief with the 20...
It's a tragic turn of events. Victims, friends, and family are demanding answers from the Cameroonian government. But the government has a problem.
Cameroon did not have an agency in charge of air accident investigations.
Investigators from several countries descend on Cameroon. Since the Boeing 737 is manufactured in the United States, Dennis Jones from the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, joins the investigation.
The fact that it was a relatively new airplane at the time certainly made it a little bit more compelling. But all around the world, those who operate these type of aircraft, they have the same question: what happened? What happened in Cameroon?
It's all from the tail. Looks like everything else is down in there.
I saw a lot of debris from the tail section. We were not able to see the wreckage itself because we were in a swamp, and that was another challenge throughout the whole process.
A technical advisor for Boeing, Mark Smith, also joins the team of investigators.
This was the toughest accident scene I've been on in my career at Boeing. We're standing there looking around at the devastation, the destruction. So we have to, as a team, start working on what happened to it. Where are the various pieces?
A key piece of evidence is quickly found: the 737's flight data recorder.
Well, looks pretty good, considering.
The FDR is sent to Canada's Transportation Safety Board to be downloaded. While searchers continue looking for the cockpit voice recorder, investigators try to determine what caused the plane to crash so soon after takeoff.
The airport is only 3.5 miles away. They can't have been in the air more than 2 minutes.
We really didn't have a clue.
You're looking for explanations. We were able to start doing a lot of on-scene examination, documentation, and trying to get an idea how it impacted the ground.
The layout of the wreckage tells investigators how the plane was flying on impact.
Completely obliterated.
So I haven't found the most of it.
Looks like it came in hard and fast.
When you have a high-speed impact like that at a nose-down attitude, you usually get extensive fragmentation of aircraft.
Well, actually, what we're trying to do is estimate, if we can, an angle and maybe even a speed of impact to try and get a feel for what happened, because once again, we don't yet have the FDR data.
How deep does this go?
More than 15 feet.
Well, definitely hit nose first. And hard.
So, was there some kind of loss of control that took place? That was what was kind of foremost on my mind.
While they wait for the flight data, investigators turn to the controller on duty that night to help fill in some blanks.
What can you tell me about that night?
The first thing is that they delayed their takeoff.
Really? How come?
There was a storm coming in from the east.
Tower 507. We are going to wait for the storm to pass. Canceling startup.
Roger 507, canceling startup.
The storm could last all night, but visibility should improve.
The airplane was on the tarmac, loaded, ready to go, waiting for the weather to clear, and then they would take off.
But 20 minutes later, they decide to take off. Why?
It cleared a bit, and they were going to try to get around it.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup.
Okay, 507. Startup approved.
The controller explains how the crew planned to fly to the right of the storm. Is it possible the crew misjudged the storm's size and strength? NTSB investigator Bill Bramble also joins the team.
They had a cell 8 miles off the end of the runway, so the crew was using their own radar to decide how to maneuver around the cell.
Here's a meteorological report from that night.
Thunderstorm and rain over the airport with winds gusting up to 20 knots. But it was starting to clear.
Investigators wonder if the wind and rain were still severe enough to bring down a 737.
He asked permission from the controller to go around the storm. To the right.
Maybe the storm was worse than he thought.
There was a weather delay for several flights. KQ-507 was one of 4 flights that were delayed on the ground for about an hour.
Investigators need to speak to other pilots who took off from Douala that night. How intense was the storm once they were in the air?
I will speak to one of the pilots tomorrow.
Investigators interview a pilot who departed immediately after Kenya Airways Flight 507. They need to find out if he had any difficulty avoiding the storm.
The flight crews solely depended on their own onboard systems to understand what they were getting into. There was no assistance from the ATC.
So, no problems at all? Not even mild turbulence?
He said the weather was smooth after they took off. They did the same thing, too. They took off and turned to the right, too, to circumnavigate the weather.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Investigators conclude the pilots could have maneuvered around the storm on their flight path.
Set.
With weather ruled out, the team wonders if there was a mechanical issue with the brand new 737.
This was important because it was the first for the 800 series, and if there's an accident and it's not immediately understood what the problem is, it's really important to get to the bottom of it.
Technicians in Canada have been able to extract the FDR data.
Let's see what we've got.
They read the data out. Altitude, airspeed, bank angle, pitch attitude, those sorts of things. Once you plot those out, you can start seeing what occurred.
Any malfunction warnings during the flight would provide an important clue.
There might have been some kind of mechanical issue that might have popped up.
No warnings.
They find no signs of any system failure.
The data showed us the airplane was behaving as we would expect it to. It was a perfectly airworthy aircraft. There's no question about it.
As the team continues looking through the data,
but look at this.
They discover that just over a minute into the flight, a different kind of alert did go off.
Bank angle alert at an altitude of 2,800 feet.
For investigators, this is their first real clue about what happened to Flight 507. Any roll exceeding 35 degrees is considered extreme. Once reaching that angle, a warning alerts pilots of danger.
Rotate.
When investigators review the pilot's inputs after takeoff, they make a critical discovery.
Gear up.
Okay.
He was turning left from the moment they left the ground.
That information showed us that right after takeoff, the aircraft started to roll to the right a little bit, and the pilot corrected it.
And then he keeps making corrections to the left.
Looks like he's trying to keep the plane level.
But what caused the slow roll to the right in the first place?
Bingo. It's the way the flaps are rigged. Give it a slight right roll.
The aircraft had a tendency to roll to the right.
The flaps increase a plane's lift at slower speeds. On this particular airplane, the left flap provided slightly more lift than the right one.
It's similar to driving down the freeway in your car and just letting go of the wheel. If I was to do that, then it'll start to drift off one way or another. That's the way the airplane was slowly and naturally banking it.
This discovery explains why the captain kept his control column turned to the left immediately after takeoff.
Well, that's weird.
But it doesn't explain an even more puzzling element of the flight data.
Look at this. The captain's control wheel input seemed to stop. It's like he just let go of it. 6 degrees right, he does nothing. 11 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, and still nothing.
As the plane's bank angle approached 35 degrees, neither pilot took action to stop the increasingly dangerous roll.
Bank angle, bank angle. Allah!
Until the bank angle warning sounded.
Bank angle.
And then he does this. Right, left, right again, left again.
In the last moments of the flight, we noticed an erratic movement of the control column that didn't make any sense. For 16 seconds after the bank angle warning, the aircraft continued its dangerous roll.
The airplane just continues to roll right up to 110 degrees of bank. The crew didn't recover it before impact.
The data paints a baffling picture of the 1.5-minute flight.
Who flies like that?
And that was puzzling to us. So it really highlighted that we needed more information, needed more data, and that data is the CVR. The CVR is what tells us the conversation, what might they have been looking at.
But after weeks of searching the crash site, there's still no sign of the cockpit voice recorder.
When the winter brings unpredictable weather,
Today is a windy day up on the mountain.
these heroes are here to battle the elements.
Oh, I'm ready for new challenges. Bring it on.
In a season that's rougher
It's a miracle that the driver is alive.
and tougher.
This tipped over now.
Stop!
Finito, capito. Goodbye.
Now the best team is together.
Ice Road Rescue.
Za vas koji pravite prve korake, da uvek nađete put kući. Dobrodošli u banku pravih prilika. Uz NLB stambeni kredit. Brzo i jednostavno. Za sve što dolazi. NLB Komercijalna banka.
Let's start the pre-flight procedures.
This flight went from being routine into a life-threatening crisis.
Damn it!
In seconds.
Do you copy?
Who was guilty? Who was to blame?
No one notices what's happening. Till it's too late.
The new season of Air Crash Investigation Special Report on National Geographic.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
It's been more than a month since the crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507. And the cockpit voice recorder has still not been found.
Over there.
We spent days scouring the site, up track, down track, everywhere, looking for the CVR, trying to find it.
The team now uses a tracking device to scan the swamp for a signal from the box. Five weeks after the crash, the cockpit voice recorder is finally recovered.
That was a very, very exciting time for everyone involved with the recovery, as well as the investigation group itself for having that information.
Okay, let's start on the ground.
Started.
Investigators hope the recording will explain why the pilots let their plane bank so dangerously to the right.
Tower, Kenya 507. Looks like there's a break in the weather. Requesting startup. Okay, 507. Startup approved. Okay. Request taxi clearance.
They hope the recording will also explain how they ended up spiraling into a swamp.
1,000 feet and climbing. Heading select.
Okay, this is where he stops making any inputs.
Selected. Check. N1. Okay, command.
That's the call to activate the autopilot.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yup.
After calling for the autopilot to be engaged, Captain Wamwea released the control column, trusting the autopilot to fly the plane. But there's a problem.
The autopilot didn't come on.
He thought the 737 was flying itself.
There was nobody flying the controls, so nothing was controlling the airplane.
The discovery changes the course of the entire investigation.
N1.
Okay, command.
Why didn't the autopilot come on?
The captain calls for the autopilot to be engaged. But the first officer does not respond.
The procedure should be for the first officer to push the button and say, the autopilot engaged.
Okay, command.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yup.
Investigators believe the first officer was so focused on inputting the route around the storm that he failed to engage the autopilot.
2,400 feet and climbing.
Now we're getting into it.
Meanwhile, the captain assumed the autopilot was engaged and controlling the pre-selected right turn. The pilots only noticed a problem when the bank angle warning went off.
Bank angle.
It's pretty clear the captain expected the autopilot to be engaged and it didn't get engaged. And then neither crew member picked up the fact that it wasn't engaged.
We're crashing! Yeah, we are crashing! Left! Left! Left correction!
Why did neither crew member take the critical step of engaging the autopilot?
Standard operating procedures provide a safety net for crews, but if crews don't adhere to the standard operating procedures, they lose that protection.
They comb through Kenya Airways procedures to see who has responsibility for activating the autopilot.
Anything?
From what I can tell, it's not really clear who is supposed to do it. All it specifies is turn on when above minimum altitude for engagement. It's not very helpful.
It wasn't really clear in the standard operating procedures of when the autopilot does come on, who's responsible for doing that and what the response should be to that.
Recovering from a 35-degree bank is not a complicated procedure. The bank angle warning is designed to give pilots enough time to react. But for some reason, this crew wasn't able to do that. The team digs into their records.
This is what we have on Wamwea.
Lots of experience. 16 years as a pilot, most of those on the 737.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
The captain had been a flight attendant for Kenya Airways years and years ago, and then went to flight school and got his ratings and transition into the role of pilot.
Wait. Look at this.
But the captain's training records reveal serious shortcomings.
Inadequate knowledge of systems and procedures, insufficient flight discipline, poor cockpit scans. Below standard. Yikes.
Get up. Okay.
We discovered the captain had a history of training difficulties and lack of systems knowledge for autoflight systems and so forth. So he had some red flags in his history.
The first officer's report isn't any better.
Failed to monitor autopilot when engaged.
V1. Rotate.
The first officer was young and fairly inexperienced. He only had a little over 800 hours of flight time, and he had had some training feedback that involved things like you need to be more proactive about calling out deviations and so forth.
Not an A-level crew.
We're crashing!
Left correction!
Did a lack of skills in the cockpit doom the 108 passengers on board the flight? Investigators need to determine if pilot error caused the horrific crash of Kenya Airways Flight 507.
Okay, Allah. He's definitely surprised. Then 22 degrees to the right, 20 left, 45 right, then 11 to the left. That's not helping.
When the bank warning came on and the aircraft was in a right roll, the first response was the captain turned it further to the right, and which aggravated the situation.
Now the bank angle is approaching 50 degrees.
As the situation grew worse after the bank angle warning and the confusion amongst the crew, the autopilot does engage, and the captain pushed that button.
The team discovers that when the captain finally realized the autopilot was not engaged, he activated it. But when it didn't immediately level the plane, the captain turned the control column erratically, an action which overrode the autopilot.
We're crashing!
Yeah, we are crashing. Then yes, we are crashing. Left, left, left correction.
So now one's trying to turn left while the other turns to the right. They're fighting each other's inputs.
Left! Left! Left correction!
Bank angle, bank angle.
I don't get it. It should have been a simple recovery.
The back and forth was trying to do corrective actions, but it didn't seem like it was correcting anything.
He's already banked over to the right, 34 or 35 degrees. Why would he roll further? Well, that's the question we have to answer right there.
Investigators use a Boeing simulator to recreate the final stages of the flight.
From the simulator, you can literally put yourself in the driver's seat and reconstruct the flight and be there as the pilot to be able to determine whether you can recover.
Can we give it a 50-degree right bank, please? Activate the autopilot, please.
Exactly what it's supposed to do. The roll is slowing.
And the inputs we discussed.
Right, left, right. Jeez. There goes the autopilot. Bank angle's increasing again.
Bank angle, bank angle.
The simulation shows that if the captain had given the autopilot enough time to take control, the 737 would have returned to a relatively safe bank angle. But his erratic inputs prevented that from happening.
If only he'd done nothing.
It was determined that recovery was still an option just a few seconds before impact, really.
Investigators are puzzled. Why wasn't the experienced captain able to execute such a straightforward recovery?
Was there something here that we were missing in the investigation that may have confused the crew? So we started looking harder at the possibility of spatial disorientation.
From the simulator?
Yeah.
Just darkness outside. No reference at all.
It was a completely black view out the windshield. If you look up out the windshield, you have no ground reference that could immediately have helped you straighten the airplane out.
Spatial disorientation is an inability to distinguish up from down, left from right. It has been known to hinder judgment and delay response times.
We're crashing! Yeah, we are crashing! Left! Left! Left direction!
Only the first officer seemed to assess the situation correctly.
What are you doing?
First thing he says is, yeah, we are crashing. It took him 10 seconds to speak up.
When the bank angle alert went off, there wasn't much discussion about what was happening until the captain said, "We're crashing."
Yeah, we are crashing!
And the first officer didn't say anything until he said that.
Left direction!
The team listens to the recording of the first leg of the flight from Abidjan to Douala. They are looking for clues as to why the first officer remained silent.
Let's hear it.
What is wrong with you?
What they hear shocks them.
This is not a line, it's a path. A path that can take you further.
This season, we're taking it up a level.
Wow. It's a dream driving the train.
This is incredible.
Good job.
Excitement, danger.
It was a most fantastic sight. All the ships streaming towards the French coast.
It only takes one step.
Oh, man.
Follow the path less traveled with brand new shows. Watch now on National Geographic.
When you really think about someone saying, let's invent a telescope that can see back to the Big Bang, like, what?
This is the most complex telescope humanity has ever built.
We have to get it right. We can't go fix it.
What will we discover that we weren't expecting to discover?
An hour-long special, Ultimate Space Telescope, on National Geographic.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
When investigators listened to the cockpit voice recording of the first leg of Kenya Airways Flight 507...
Sorry, did you say an altitude of 14,000 feet?
Yes. Don't be so stupid. Write it down if you can't remember.
Wow.
They're stunned by how the captain treated his first officer.
It was pretty bad. The captain was sort of browbeating the first officer. There were words like stupid, shut up, stuff like that you wouldn't expect to hear in a professional crew environment.
What is wrong with you? Did you not hear the instruction? Heading 230. Understand?
The first officer seemed to kind of shut down.
Heading 230. Understand?
He was, at a certain point, sort of reduced to responding with these sort of monosyllabic grunts.
Investigators suspect this might explain why the first officer took so long to speak up.
The captain's behavior toward the first officer on the first flight likely caused him to adopt sort of a passive role. You need both pilots actively engaged in checking each other and catching errors, and if one pilot adopts a passive role, they're going to be less effective.
So, heightened ego.
Captain Wanwia's treatment of his first officer leads investigators to examine his professional history more closely.
Can you tell me more information?
We spent a lot of time going through pilot records, interviewing other flight crew members.
Were there any?
Yes.
They quickly learned that the captain's shortcomings were not limited to his flying abilities.
He had a lot of concerning things in his training files about being overbearing, being authoritarian in terms of how he dealt with other crew members.
So, we have a young, reserved first officer and an overbearing captain.
This accident is kind of a throwback to those early days where we were focused on the issues of overly assertive, authoritarian, overbearing captains and submissive, inadequately assertive junior first officers.
A lethal combination.
Investigators conclude the bad pairing in this flight crew set in motion a sequence of events that led to the crash.
As an investigator, all of these accidents I've worked, it's very clear there is never a single cause. It's always a chain of events.
So, should I remain on this heading?
Yup.
A deadly combination of poor pilot performance and spatial disorientation contributed to the accident.
All the risk factors were present. There was distraction, there was reduced outside visibility, and there was confusion.
But in the end, investigators conclude that one major mistake triggered the entire tragedy.
N1. Okay, Command. So, should I remain on this heading?
Yep.
It was the crew's failure to ensure the autopilot was turned on. That ultimately led to the death of 114 people.
We're crashing!
In the aftermath of Flight 507's crash, Cameroon's Commission of Inquiry makes a series of recommendations, including the regular update of safety manuals related to cockpit procedure and crew responsibility.
They made changes to the standard operating procedures about who's responsible for engaging the autopilot, and that was very key.
And improved pilot training with a focus on upset recovery.
One technology that Boeing has tested and developed and is looking at putting into its airplanes is a roll recovery arrow, so that if you're at an unusual angle of bank, the attitude display will actually show you which direction you need to roll the airplane and provide an accompanying oral.
In the end, you have to look at training, crew makeup, all adding into all the links of chain, the chain that caused this to happen this night.
Let's see what this storm is doing.
And those who are not familiar with accident investigation think that all the answers are at the crash site. It's rarely at the crash site. And that's exactly what happened.
Rotate.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
Airfield in sight, runway in sight.
Two pilots within a few feet of making a safe landing. crash short of the runway in Colombia.
Our number one priority was the passengers and getting everyone to safety.
The 737 broke apart upon hitting the ground.
Investigators search for a possible cause, but find no useful evidence.
And we still can't explain why.
It's not until they scrutinize the entire chain of events that they finally catch a break.
That's it. What?
Climb, Captain!
Just after midnight, Aries Flight 8250 is carrying a plane load of tourists and locals from Bogota to the small Colombian island of San Andres, an ocean playground in the Caribbean Sea.
So much for grabbing dinner on the ground.
Yeah, it's gonna be a late night.
Captain Wilson Gutierrez is a veteran pilot with almost 20 years of flying experience.
At least we're finally up in the air.
First Officer Camilo Piñeros has flown for Aries for 3 years, with a full year on the airline's new Boeing 737s.
Looks like there's some weather ahead of us.
Let's keep an eye on it.
There are signs of a thunderstorm in the distance. For the next hour and 30 minutes, the 737 will fly northwest to San Andres at a cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Passengers are restless after an unexpected 4-hour delay getting off the ground.
We should be landing just before 2 a.m.
Flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina is working hard to settle passengers, many heading to the small island for a holiday.
The flight was running late because it was coming from Cali, and it was late due to poor weather. They said it was running 2 hours behind, but it actually ended up being twice that.
Just over 40 minutes into the flight, the captain sees the storm clouds ahead are building.
Airlines operate 24 hours a day, so pilots fly in all kinds of conditions, both daylight, dark, good weather, bad weather. As a professional pilot, you deal with these environmental challenges constantly.
Prior to beginning our descent into San Andres, we began to experience some light turbulence.
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
It was raining. There was lightning, a lot of lightning, and the turbulence started to intensify.
Now past the halfway point of the trip. The captain is increasingly concerned with the possibility of heavy storms gathering over their destination.
It doesn't look like we're gonna get any relief from this storm.
Yeah, lots of activity tonight.
Closer to San Andres, the already bumpy ride is getting worse and worse for the passengers.
Normally you go through a patch and then it stops. In this instance, there was lightning bolt after lightning bolt, and the plane shook hard and the turbulence would not stop.
Check it out, Camilo. It's building all around the island. This bad weather be in San Andreas.
Less than 20 minutes away from the airport, the weather on the ground appears to be changing rapidly.
Get a report from San Andreas for me.
Okay, I'll ask.
The San Andres air traffic controller is also keeping a close eye on changes to the weather.
San Andres, good morning. Itis 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Okay, Air 8250. Wind calm, visibility more than 10 kilometers, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. There's some bad weather near the airfield, but right now there's no rain.
Despite the turbulent weather along the way, conditions in San Andres seem to be much better.
Air 8250, descend 3,000 feet, clear for approach, runway 06.
Roger, continue descending to 3,000.
In the cabin, passengers are growing concerned by the intensity of the storm.
This shouldn't last long.
We told them that we were in an intense weather system and that we would be out of it shortly, but we never actually got out of it.
There is a thunderstorm over the airport right now.
Okay, Roger, thank you.
Gear down.
Air 8250, there's a little drizzle over the runway.
A little what? Drizzle. Okay, give them the announcement.
Cabin crew to their stations for landing.
Please reach your table.
As the storm continues to build, Ares 8250 is about to begin its final approach.
Okay, flaps 5.
Wet runway, 3 on the auto brake.
Let's leave it on 2.
The crew configures the plane for landing. The weather in San Andres is changing fast.
Air 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
Visibility down to 5 kilometers.
Oh, man.
When you see particularly the weather that's deteriorating, it causes you to be a little bit more cautious because the trend is not going in a positive direction.
The rain became even more intense, the turbulence more intense, and the thunder was more frequent.
In deteriorating conditions, and just 7 miles from landing, the captain confirms the procedure in the event they have to abort the landing at the last minute.
In case we miss the approach, we go right, correct?
Yes, correct, sir.
As you get closer to your destination and you start getting the latest weather, the thing that you're thinking about is, okay, how are we going to position the airplane to land in these conditions? And if we don't land, what are we going to do next?
Only minutes away from landing, the pilots run through their final checks.
Landing checklist.
Speed brakes.
Armed.
Landing gear.
Down.
Flaps.
30.
Checklist complete.
We were about 5 minutes from landing. I started to see lights in the ocean from the island.
But less than 2.5 minutes from touchdown, visibility has reduced dramatically.
Air 8250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative.
Not yet.
Seconds later,
Airfield in sight, runway in sight. Itis 8250.
the clouds over San Andres lift.
In sight landing.
Check, we're all set for landing.
500 feet from the ground, the crew spots the runway. The captain lines up his plane.
Air 0250 winds at 60 degrees at 15 knots.
Then the wind picks up.
50 knots, head on. In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
Caught in a sudden deluge, visibility decreases again.
Look out, Captain.
The first officer now realizes they are too low to make a safe landing.
Can you make it?
20.
Climb, Captain!
The captain pulls back on his control column, but it's too late.
We felt a hard and sudden crash.
At 1:47 a.m., Ares 8250 slams into the ground, with 131 passengers and crew on board.
There's been an accident.
When the winter brings unpredictable weather,
Today is a windy day up on the mountain.
these heroes are here to battle the elements.
Oh, I'm ready for new challenges. Bring it on.
In a season that's rougher
It's a miracle that the driver is alive.
and tougher.
This tipped over now. Stop! Finito, capito. Goodbye. Now the best team is together.
Ice Road Rescue.
Kada je mokrenje otežano usled pritiska koji pravi uvećana prostata, Prostamol Uno stiže u pomoć. Prostamol Uno, tradicionalni biljni lek za probleme sa mokrenjem usled uvećane prostate. Kada vas alarmira prostata, reagujte kao pravi muškarac. Prostamol Uno. Pre upotrebe detaljno proučiti uputstvo o indikacijama, merama opreza i neželjenim reakcijama na lek, posavitujte se sa lekarom ili farmaceutom.
Ko kaže da zdravlje zavisi od godina? Ili da ne smemo picu pre pilatesa? Mi kažemo, za aktivnost vam ne treba sportska oprema. Živite kao da vas niko ne gleda. Šta god da radite, Centrum ima posebno formulisanu kombinaciju vitamina i minerala za podršku vašim nutritivnim potrebama.
Novi Big Hybrid Flex savršeno brije. I da, oštrice mogu da mu se zamene. Kupi bilo koji Big Hybrid Flex brijač, pošalji SMS sa brojem računa na 3311 i osvoji električni bicikl ili električni trotinet. Saznaj više na bigflexnagradnaigra.com.
Za sve koji su željni akcije, Lili drogerije su pune uzbuđenja i iznenađenja. A akcije su svakoga dana na svakom koraku, u svim Lili drogerijama. Iskoristite 30% popusta na sve Eat Skin proizvode do 28. oktobra.
Dobar ukus stiže i nikad je bliže. Pred tobom je mnogo kombinacija i dobrih vibracija. Ne znaš šta bi pre? Probaj sve. Novi Dr. Edgar Natural Vibes. Organski kakao prah, ovsene kaše i smeša za mafine sa ovsenim pahuljicama, bez dodatog šećera. Podeli dobre vibracije.
Za neke se stvari lako zagrejati. Kao za domaći ukus Podravka supe, koji u naše živote uvek donosi osjećaj topline. Baš zato smo zagrejani za supu već 65 godina. Podravka.
Kivi u korpici kilogram 149, smeša za roštilj meso 179, sendvič kobasica bačka 100 grama 74,90 u Univer Exportu.
Abandoned, but not forgotten. Neglected, but still reminding of its history.
Looks like something from Mad Max meets Waterworld. What's it doing there?
Decaying ruins, deserted towns hiding their secrets, remnants of an ancient world haunted by the ghosts of the past. Let's discover their secrets. Abandoned Engineering. New season premieres on the 4th of November at 10 p.m. on National Geographic. Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
Ares 8250 has crashed just short of touchdown in San Andres and broken into 3 pieces. Inside the front section of the airplane, flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina has survived the horrific crash.
Are you okay?
Bruised and battered, passengers near the front start lining up towards the aircraft's main door and the emergency slide. But now a new problem. The main exit door is jammed.
My coworker and I tried to open the door, but it would not open. A passenger helped us to open it.
The flight attendants work as quickly as possible to get all 125 passengers off the plane.
Our #1 priority was the passengers and getting everyone to safety. So we were all focused on that.
In the aftermath of the recovery, one passenger is dead after being hit in the chest by a tray table. A second passenger who was severely injured on impact dies in hospital 2 weeks later.
When you think of boarding an aircraft, you imagine leaving it in the same manner. Not forcibly or in pain, fear, frustration. It's something you can never imagine happening.
The crash and destruction of Flight 8250 is quickly becoming a major international news story.
A plane crashed this morning in Colombia. The 737 broke apart upon hitting the ground.
The Colombian Aeronautical Authority needs to find out what brought down one of the most widely used passenger planes on Earth. Investigator Julian Echeverri is one of the first investigators on the scene.
Huh. Broken into 3 pieces. He was definitely lined up for a landing.
From the orientation of the wreckage, investigators can tell that Flight 8250 was lined up perfectly with the runway at San Andrés.
Al iniciar el reconocimiento de los restos, pudimos observar el primer impacto.
When we first looked at the debris, we observed that the initial impact was approximately 40 meters from the start of runway 06. It was a low-angle impact at a relatively high speed.
Con un bajo ángulo y una relativa alta velocidad.
Very quickly, both the flight data and cockpit voice recorders are recovered.
Excellent work. Let's hope they provide some answers.
But until the recordings can be analyzed, investigators will need to rely on the wreckage at the crash site to explain the cause of the accident. The team studies the debris trail that extends 160 feet from the runway's threshold.
Landing gear extended. Snapped off. Lined up and configured, but somehow they hit the ground hard, meters from the runway.
Investigators can't understand why the jet got so close to the runway, but ended up short. While wreckage crews transport the debris to a nearby facility for analysis, investigators wonder what role the severe weather played in the accident.
What if the storm brought them down?
The team studies meteorological reports from the night of the crash.
Era una gran hipótesis que teníamos también dentro de todo.
The meteorological condition during the accident was one of the things we considered in this investigation.
Existían meteorológicamente hablando al momento del accidente.
Based on the first information that we received. Turn that up, would you?
Y la primera información que tenemos es que aparentemente un rayo
A lightning bolt struck the airplane and caused the tragedy that we're all aware of. They're saying it's lightning? We'll see.
Echeverri and his team know that accidents caused by lightning are virtually unheard of.
Lightning strikes, although they're very spectacular and can visually impair you just with that bright flash, they really don't pose a great threat to the airplane during landing.
Investigators need to know if there was lightning near the 737 as it approached San Andres.
There was video evidence from a closed-circuit television camera which recorded the final moments prior to the accident.
Sure looks like lightning. The timing fits.
Se observaba un destello muy grande.
There was a big flash in the video, which led us to think that the aircraft could have been struck by lightning.
Alcanzada por una descarga eléctrica.
The team studies the static wicks from the accident plane. Static wicks are located on the trailing edges of airplane wings and help discharge any buildup of static energy.
If the plane was struck by lightning, they should be melted or burned.
But they are not. Investigators can find no signs of a direct lightning hit on the aircraft's surfaces.
During the inspection of the debris, which was carefully performed, we found no traces of interaction with lightning.
They're clean.
But Echeverri still has a lot of unanswered questions about the weather at the time of the accident.
Looks like it was a big storm.
Las condiciones en las que la aeronave...
The conditions in which the aircraft interacted with the terrain before arriving at runway 06 raised the possibility of an encounter with wind shear in that last minute.
En ese último minuto con un wind shear.
Wind shear is a phenomenon in which the wind's direction or speed changes extremely abruptly.
60-degree winds at 15 knots. The wind was picking up.
Could intense winds at the base of the runway have played a role in the crash?
We need to look at wind shear.
The team learns that just 2 minutes before the crash, as the storm built, winds near the runway were gusting. Digging further into the flight data.
So, lots of headwind, but almost no downdraft.
Investigator Julian Echeverri discovers the powerful winds were hitting the plane head-on, not from above.
Not enough to slam them to the ground.
Al momento del aterrizaje de ese último instante.
During the landing, there was an increase in wind speed, but in this case, it was a horizontal increase. There was no trace in the flight data of a vertical change of wind that would have caused the aircraft to lose altitude.
Cambio en el viento, en este caso, hecho perder al cierto tipo de altitud en la aeronave como tal.
All investigators uncover is a moderate headwind at the time of the crash. A discovery that leads nowhere.
So we'll rule out weather for now.
El hecho que no pudiese haber sido un wind shear, que esa era la hipótesis que más...
The fact that it was not wind shear made us focus on operational aspects that may have led to this accident.
En observar los aspectos operacionales que condujeron a este accidente como tal.
What about the aircraft itself?
Investigators now wonder if an engine malfunction led to the crash of Ares Flight 8250.
The blades are bent in the opposite direction of the rotation.
That tells investigator Julian Echeverri that the engines were working when they hit the ground.
Let's move on.
Measurements of the flap settings show they were in the correct position for landing.
Okay, flaps 5. Wet runway, 3 on the auto brake. Let's leave it on 2.
Flaps right where they should be.
In fact, investigators find nothing to indicate a mechanical cause for the crash of Ares 8250.
Se observaron las superficies de control de vuelo.
We observed the flight control surfaces. We observed the flap configuration, the cockpit switches.
Engines, rudder, control surfaces, you name it, they all check out.
There weren't any system malfunctions or engine or GPS problems that would have caused the aircraft to land before the start of the runway.
Lieutenant Colonel Ever Sabogal from the Colombian Air Force joins the investigative team.
The conditions that they had, conditions of extremely bad weather, a particularly dark night. They had a lot of lightning all around them, and they were feeling pressure to land.
Were they prepared to land in these stormy conditions?
Investigators now need to find out if the storm took the pilots by surprise. If it did, that might have led them to make errors in their approach.
The critical part is what's the weather going to be when we get there. It's less critical of what it is right now. So as you get very close to the airport, that's when you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of the weather that you're about to deal with in the final approach segment of the flight.
Can I show you this?
The team already knows the weather was changing quickly just before the crash. But they need to determine if the air traffic controller kept them up to date.
I updated them regularly once they were in my airspace.
San Andres, good morning. IDIS 8250.
Go ahead.
We want to know how the weather is at the airport, please.
Okay, Airs 8250. Wind calm, visibility more than 10 kilometers, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. There's some bad weather near the airfield, but right now there's no rain. Every time the weather changed even a bit, I told them.
Gear down.
Airs 8250, there's a little drizzle over the runway.
A little what? Drizzle.
Minutes later, it turned into a full-blown storm.
Airs 8250, there's now heavy rain at the airfield and visibility reduced to 5 kilometers.
Did they seem concerned about the weather?
No, they didn't sound overly concerned. I was very careful to tell them everything.
The controllers are very good about reading up changing weather conditions, particularly wind and visibility, which is the two most critical factors as they get very close to the airport. But the decision to land or not to land rests with the captain. And he or she is responsible to make the decision whether the conditions are safe to land or not.
Airs 8250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative. Not yet. Airfield in sight, runway in sight. IDIS 8250.
And this is appropriate because it's really only the pilots that can see the exact conditions that the airplane is in and the visibility they have to be able to see the runway and land safely on it.
Look out, Captain!
This is Romania, where contrasting landscapes embrace old legends. With Gothic castles, winding mountain roads, and wintry forest railways, and where rural traditions meet modern engineering to help rebuild the past. Europe from Above, the new season, continues with Romania on National Geographic.
Novi Big Hybrid Flex savršeno brije. I da, oštrice mogu da mu se zamene. Kupi bilo koji Big Hybrid Flex brijač, pošalji SMS sa brojem računa na 3311 i osvoji električni bicikl ili električni trotinet. Saznaj više na bigflexnagradnaigra.com.
svežinu tik-tak ukusa otkrivaš nežno, sloj po sloj. Tik-tak, osveži svoj dan nežnošću. Na tik-tak pakovanjima skeniraj QR kod i uživaj u velikom izboru muzike, igrica i ostalog.
Kada otvoriš Pepsi, uživaj u tom sjajnom ukusu, koji neće učiniti da izgledaš savršeno, a neće ni razvedriti svaki dan. Sorry, ali je baš dobar ukus. I to je jedino što je važno. Zato ne slušaj šta drugi govore i prati svoj ukus.
Svake jeseni i zime virusi i bakterije pokreću zabavu koja može pokvariti vašu. Tantum Verde pomaže brzo i efikasno. Tantum Verde ublažava bolne upale grla i usne duplje.
Pre upotrebe detaljno proučiti uputstvo o indikacijama, merama opreza i neželjenim reakcijama na lek, posavjetovati se sa lekarom ili farmaceutom.
Dobar ukus stiže i nikad je bliže. Pred tobom je mnogo kombinacija i dobrih vibracija. Ne znaš šta bi pre? Probaj sve. Novi Dr. Edgar Natural Vibes. Organski kakao prah, ovsene kaše i smeše za mafine sa ovsenim pahuljicama. Bez dodatog šećera. Podeli dobre vibracije. Tu smo za male i velike planove. Tu smo za planirane i neplanirane situacije. Za ideje i snove. Za sve te stvari koje su čekale jesen. Posjetite jednu od naših ekspozitura da zajedno nađemo rešenje. Cash krediti i krediti za refinansiranje Unicredit banke.
When you really think about someone saying, let's invent a telescope that can see back to the Big Bang. Like, what?
This is the most complex telescope humanity has ever built.
We have to get it right. We can't go fix it.
What will we discover that we weren't expecting to discover?
An hour-long special, Ultimate Space Telescope, on National Geographic.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
Investigators now have the flight data from Ares Flight 8250.
The digital flight data recorder records hundreds or thousands of different parameters, and it tells you everything that the airplane's doing, whether the landing gear's up or down, the altitude, airspeed, and numerous other functions of the systems within the airplane.
The team is looking for clues that might indicate how the pilots handled the plane in the thunderstorm.
Here, 45 minutes before reaching the airport, they switched to vertical speed mode.
That's a questionable choice.
The investigators noticed that the pilots selected an autopilot mode called vertical speed.
Airspeed to 50, descend 3,000 feet, clear for approach runway 06.
In vertical speed mode, the crew must manually select their rate of descent.
This mode requires a lot of work because you have to be constantly calculating your altitude versus your distance.
The Boeing procedures are typically to utilize automation, use the autopilot during approaches, particularly in bad weather. For these pilots to have reverted to a manual system where they turn the autopilot off is against the Boeing recommendation.
Investigators check the plane's rate of descent.
Look at this. They were descending to the runway at 1,100 feet per minute.
According to the manufacturer, rate of descent shouldn't exceed 900 feet per minute.
It's an important clue.
If they are in excess of 1,000 feet per minute, then it is unstable approach.
The team has now determined the plane was dropping too fast, and they have a theory as to why.
They must have been trying to get a visual fix of the runway as soon as possible.
By bringing the airplane down early, the hope is that you'll see the runway earlier. You'll be underneath the clouds, and your visibility will be improved the lower you get.
But that strategy didn't work for the crew of the Ares flight. The question is, why not? The investigators can now compare the approach the crew should have flown to the one they actually did fly.
They should have stayed on the glide path.
But instead, they come in too low the entire way.
And they didn't even try to get back on the glide path.
He played instead the entire time with the vertical speed. They didn't have an angle or a constant path, and that made it so that they were always below it. They were never on the right path for the type of approach that they made.
Didn't they know they were coming in too low?
Wouldn't the PAPI lights have told them that?
PAPI lights, or Precision Approach Path Indicators, are color-coded lights along the side of the runway that tell pilots if they are too high or too low on their approach. The airport's PAPI lights were fully operational that night, yet the plane still came in low.
Why would a person operating an aircraft make that type of approach, even when the visual aids are indicating the correct path to the runway? The team hopes the cockpit voice recorder can provide answers to all their unanswered questions. They focus on the final approach.
Landing checklist. Speed brakes. Armed. Landing gear.
Down. Flaps. 30. Checklist complete. We're too low.
President 250, do you have the runway in sight?
Negative.
Not yet.
Airway in sight, runway in sight, IDIS 8250.
In sight landing. Check, we're all set for landing.
Stop. Did you catch that? Go back 30 seconds.
Checklist complete. We're too low.
President 250, do you have the runway in sight?
Stop. The captain realizes they're below the glide path, but there's no discussion about it. No go-around.
They just keep going.
Why? Continue.
On the final approach, the captain simply continues to fly, focused on trying to reach the runway.
50 knots, head on. In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir.
Everything sounds okay?
Look out, Captain.
40, 30, 20.
Climb, Captain!
First officer knows something isn't right.
But the captain doesn't respond.
Why not?
The investigation finally has a solid lead to follow. Investigators are baffled by the captain's actions on board Flight 8250. They question him about what happened on the approach to San Andres.
I didn't think anything went wrong until the crash. It was stormy. It must have been the lightning or the wind.
Nunca cuestionan el tipo de aproximación que hicieron.
They never questioned the type of approach that they made. They never doubted that their procedure was adequate, and they said it was probably the wind that caused their accident.
Probablemente fue el viento el que ocasionó el accidente.
But when the captain is asked about his use of the PAPI lights, his answer provides the first big break in the investigation.
I'm not sure what the PAPI lights were showing. I was focused on the green lights at the threshold, like I always do.
Airfield in sight, runway in sight. IDIS 8250.
In sight landing.
Check, we're all set for landing.
Ellos estaban concentrados.
They were concentrated on the green lights at the start of the runway, and they ignored the information of the PAPI lights.
De las luces PAPI.
Instead of landing in the touchdown zone, which is here, The captain says that he always lands here on the threshold.
Se vio recurrentemente en sus registros ciertas técnicas.
We noticed in his statement a recurring flight technique that involved pointing the nose of the aircraft at the runway for approaches and landings.
Nariz hacia la cabecera de la pista.
The thinking of some pilots has been, I want on the runway as early as possible so that I can make sure that we get stopped if there's a problem with the brakes. So they deliberately land short of the touchdown zone.
Possibly, that's what the pilot was doing the whole time, looking for the green lights and trying to make it.
Investigators ask the captain why he performed the landing this way.
That's my training. I was just doing what we've always done.
Se dio una.
We saw that the crew decided to make an approach using their own criteria, not the criteria recommended by the manufacturer.
Por fuera de lo que se está estableciendo por el fabricante.
Investigators need to know what led the crew to do this. They dig into their background.
Check this out. He's only been flying a 737 for 8 months.
12 years before that, he flew turboprops.
The file reveals that Captain Gutierrez recently switched from commanding Dash 8 turboprops to the much larger 737 jets. The discovery provides a new clue.
That's it. What? He was flying like he was in a turboprop.
Not a 737.
The investigators found that the higher rate of descent that they flew in the 737 was much more like the profile that you would expect in the turboprop that they had flown previously.
Al acumular uno muchísima experiencia.
In accumulating so much experience in the turboprops, you develop habits, and when one translates this to the cockpit of jets, one starts to battle with all the tools that make your trip secure.
Que te hacen el vuelo seguro.
We got to find out if these guys were properly trained to fly a 737.
Ares started as a small regional airline flying turboprops around central Colombia. Then in 2009, the year before the crash, Ares underwent a huge expansion, adding 9 737s to its fleet. Normally, the industry practice is to hire experienced 737 pilots to fly the new jets. But that's not what Ares did.
Okay, thanks very much. They didn't hire any new pilots for the 737s. They just transitioned the turboprop pilots into them.
That's a big leap.
In turboprops, everything is much easier. It's a slower plane. It reacts faster. It raises up easily. A turboprop is very forgiving. A jet doesn't forgive.
What did Ares do to safely transition their pilots onto the new 737s? The investigators take a closer look at the crew's training records.
The captain switched over to a 737 after only 5 weeks of training.
First officer only trained for 2 weeks.
The team concludes the pilots didn't have enough training to properly prepare them to fly the 737.
Lo más importante de la transición es desarraigar.
The most important thing about the transition is to undo those concepts that one has of flying turboprops and really just start over. Jets are planes that require a lot of anticipation. They require a lot of concentration. They require you to understand what a computer is doing.
Requiere entender lo que está haciendo un computador.
Investigators now conclude the captain likely reverted back to his turboprop habits while trying to land at the San Andres airport.
So just as he would in a turboprop, he aims for the threshold, but he crashes short of that. And we still can't explain why.
it's a necessity to get out and capitalize in this time of year. Alaska has a very short growing season, so it's kind of a one-shot opportunity.
When you have a homestead, there's no such thing as done. I saw the bear opening our door. It's just another weird year in Alaska.
It's out with the cold and in with the new. A brand new season, Alaska, the Next Generation, on National Geographic.
This is Romania, where contrasting landscapes embrace old legends. With Gothic castles, winding mountain roads, and wintry forest railways. And where rural traditions meet modern engineering to help rebuild the past. Europe from Above, the new season, continues with Romania on National Geographic.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
Investigators now know that the captain of Ares 8250 was purposely trying to land his airplane on the threshold of the runway.
Insight landing.
Check, we're all set for landing.
The same way he used to land in a turboprop.
500. Ares 8250 winds at 60 degrees at 15 knots.
50 knots, head on.
But that still doesn't explain why the crew crashed short of the runway. The last piece of the puzzle is elusive. The investigators listen to the cockpit recording once more, hoping to hear something they missed.
50.
Look out, Captain.
40. 30.
Can you make it?
20.
Climb, Captain!
So from the point he gets a visual of the runway, the captain does nothing to correct his altitude, right up to the crash.
Not even when the first officer gives him warnings.
So what's going on in his head?
When the investigators looked at the flight profile and they realized that it ended up impacting the ground short of the runway without ever really arresting itself and trying to hop up to the runway or make power adjustments until the very last minute. The next question is, what is this consistent with? This is a classic undershoot accident in just about every sense. It's a classic black hole illusion accident.
The black hole illusion occurs on dark nights when there are no ground lights between an airplane and the runway threshold. The contrast between the lights and the total darkness creates an illusion that deceives pilots into thinking the runway is closer than it really is, causing them to put the plane down too early.
This creates the visual illusion like in a black hole, where you completely lose your depth perception.
Una aproximación de noche.
It was a nighttime approach on an island with no noticeable difference between land and water.
Entre lo que es el agua y la tierra, y obviamente
and only the runway lights as reference.
En este modo manual.
When doing this manually and visually, the risk for entering a black hole illusion increases.
En una condición de agujero negro.
You have rain causing poor visibility, some lights on the right, very few. The runway lights, that's about it. It's a black hole illusion.
In case of wind shear, we use maximum thrust for a go-around. Don't touch flaps or gear.
Agreed, yes, sir. En este caso, el efecto...
In this case, the black hole effect was made worse by another effect that was generated by the lights of the aircraft with the rain. Why? Because when the lights of the plane go on, you start to see the rain falling. The wipers start up, and they also distract you. And the brain has to play with all that and be able to identify where the runway is.
You take all the problems the Ares 8250 had, and it still doesn't necessarily give you a plane crash. But throw a black hole in there, and it makes sense.
The black hole illusion is the final piece of the puzzle.
That's why the crew was constantly below the flight path without being aware of it, and they never made it to the runway.
Y nunca llegaron a la pista.
The Colombian Aeronautical Authority issues a series of recommendations, including a revision of Ares Airlines procedures for visual landings.
In this accident, there is no one reason. There are many reasons that brought them to this. The type of approach, the kind of training.
El tipo de entrenamiento.
Can you make it?
Una de las recomendaciones que considero
I think one of the most important recommendations from this investigation was strengthening crew training, especially for those transitioning from turboprop to jet.
turboprops y avionaves jet.
For flight attendant Adriana Cardenas Medina, the memory of the doomed flight still haunts her.
My life became a struggle. I was left with irreparable physical injuries and with psychological trauma, which I will probably never fully overcome. What I experienced was outside of the norm and was totally devastating.
Desesperante.
For investigators, the crash of Ares 8250 is a cautionary tale about the dangers of an undertrained crew.
La recomendación más importante que apuntaba a
The most important recommendation we gave was about ensuring and strengthening the crew training
para que esto sea una defensa
and following manufacturers' instructions so that they can prevent these types of accidents.
Not recommended for persons under the age of 12.
The slumbering volcanic peak of Mount St. Helens. In its shadow, one of America's most beautiful national forests. A magnet for vacationers seeking the great outdoors. But then, without warning, the volcano erupts. In just 4 minutes, the blast flattens 570 square kilometers. Huge mudflows surge down 240 kilometers of river valleys. 57 people die. With all eyes on the mountain, why did no one predict such a catastrophic eruption? Behind natural disasters are a chain of critical events. Unravel the clues and count down those final seconds from disaster. The American Northwest, Washington State, Mount St. Helens. At 2,950 meters, the spectacular volcanic peak